What's going on, everyone? Anthony from Chronometer Check here, and today we're going to be taking a close look at one of the Seiko SKX air quote predecessors. This is the Seiko 5 sports diver SRPD95, nicknamed the 5KX. Now, before we get into the full review, I just want to say thank you so much for all the support you've shown me lately. If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button to be notified for future reviews, and don't forget to hit that like button. The YouTube algorithm helps me out. So the Seiko 5 Sports Diver is clearly, at least visually, a spin on the beloved Seiko SKX. With that said, it does lack a few features that made the SKX so beloved, like an ISO certification, screw down crown, 200 meters of water resistance, but it is met with a few different upgrades, including, at least visually, can be debated whether or not it is an upgrade, but at least some refinements, let's call it. For example, the hour markers, we could see that this time they are applied instead of the Seiko SKX's painted hour markers. And this gives the 5KX a feeling of a little bit dressier, a little bit classier. I mean, this is a watch that I think would look much more appropriate in an office or a business casual kind of situation, where the SKX, sure, you could definitely get away with it if you really want to, but probably not ideal. And we see a couple of other elements that kind of really bring the watch to life, such as the very dynamic sunburst dial that is kind of in between a black, gray, and a very dark brown, depending on the lighting condition that hits it. And that is complemented well by the warm tones in the filling of the hour markers and the handset. Speaking of which, the handset is very reminiscent of the SKX's handset. However, this time we have a second hand with a red painted tip and is just also steel as opposed to the SKX's white second hand. One of my minor gripes about this particular version we are using is the white chapter ring, which I think just adds a little bit too much depth, visual depth at least, to the dial, which is cool in a way, but I think the white is a little bit too stark, a little bit too contrasty with the warmer tones on both the dial and the hour markers and handset itself. Now, it does match the day date wheel at 3 o'clock, which again, I know some people tend to either love or hate, but in general, I think in the future I might be opting to swap this model for something with a little bit more of a traditional, less contrasty chapter ring, but that's just my personal preference more than anything. So overall, there have been some design changes to make this watch less of a tool watch, more of an everyday, slightly dressy kind of diver. Taking a look at the watches side by side, you can clearly see some of the visual distinctions and how they are set apart from each other. The SKX has a very clear visual identity of being a dive tool watch that, is rugged. It'll survive whatever you throw at it, whereas this is kind of meant for more everyday usage. Now, taking a closer look at the dial, we can see again another large change is the dial text and logo itself. Instead of the traditional Seiko painted logo name, we have the new 5KX logo at 12 o'clock, which some people tend to either hate or some people tend to not mind. Personally, I don't mind it, but I know some people absolutely cannot stand it. And at 6 o'clock, we have the text automatic written in script, which I think does work on this particular 5KX model, as it is a little bit dressier. However, on some of the other models, I think it does look a little bit out of place, as it looks almost a little too fancy for some of the more tool watch styles of 5KX divers. Now, the bezel insert itself is coin edge, very, very similar, if not exactly the same as the Seiko SKX, as is pretty much the rest of the case, minus a few distinctions, but at least, from a size perspective and from the case itself, the cases are nearly identical with a few changes. But the coin edge bezel is consistent with the Seiko SKX to the point where if you do have mod parts for the Seiko SKX's bezel, it would even fit the 5KX. And if we take a look at the bezel action, it is a unidirectional 120 click bezel that, in traditional Seiko fashion, just barely misses the mark in terms of lining up. Thank you, Seiko QC, you still haven't fixed that. Taking a look at the fit and finish on the case has brushed surfaces on the top that are met with polished on the sides, kind of curving down ever so slightly, just like the Seiko SKX. This is going to be a very, very wearable piece, and you will see when we throw this on in just a minute. It's a piece that is very comfortable, certainly sizable on the wrist and has some presence, but not too large, and I think it does wear quite well on a variety of different wrist sizes. Now, a couple of notes about the specifications of this watch. It only has 100 meters of water resistance. Now, generally that's more than appropriate for swimming, going in the ocean, of course, getting caught in the rain, washing your hands. However, you're not really going to be able to dive in this watch. You're not going to be able to dive in this watch, although that's likely not a problem for the type of person that this watch is suited for. Like I said, kind of more an everyday, kind of casual watch, where yes, the Seiko SKX was a true professional ISO certified dive watch, so you are losing that a little bit here, and if that's what you're looking for, you know, you're going to look elsewhere. But 100 meters of water resistance is going to be more than adequate for most people in their everyday usage. One of my large gripes about the specs about this watch is that Seiko still continued with the Hardlex crystal. Hardlex, in case you don't know, is Seiko's proprietary crystal, which is more scratch resistant than mineral crystals, but not as scratch resistant as sapphire. Now in the Seiko SKX, I could kind of justify that because it is a tool watch, and actually sapphire, although it's more scratch resistant, can technically be a little bit more dangerous if it shatters, whereas mineral crystals or Seiko Hardlex, if it does crack, you know, it's not going to shatter, and it's not like a piece of glass that's going to cut you. So obviously that's something that's rarely ever going to happen, but I'm talking about more in the case of like professional dive usage. But given the fact that there are alternatives these days, like for example the Orient Komatsu, which does have a sapphire crystal for a very, very similar price point, I think it's kind of hard to justify Hardlex crystal any longer at this same price point. One of the very welcome additions that Seiko has finally decided to add, however, is the new 4R36 movement. Well, at least new to the Seiko 5 lineup. Previously, Seiko was using a very bare bones entry-level 7S26, and now the 4R36 movement is kind of the predecessor of that. Now, it's not an accurate movement by any means. I believe it comes in somewhere around plus or minus 25 seconds per day, so definitely not the most accurate, at least rated in specifications wise. However, generally these can be regulated pretty easily, and you know, personally I found mine to run within, you know, plus or minus 4 to 6 seconds per day, which tends to be pretty decent at least. But one of the major advantages of this particular movement, by the way, yes, it is Seiko in-house movement. The entire watch is built in-house, which is quite an impressive feat itself, and one of the many marvels of affordable Seiko. But the movement does have hacking and hand winding, so if we take a feel of the crown and we, you know, rotate it clockwise, by the way, no screw down crown, unfortunate, but that does attribute to the only 100 meters of water resistance. But if we give the crown a wind, it feels a little bit gritty, as you would expect from a more affordable movement, but also not terrible. It doesn't feel cheap by any means. It's just not the smoothest winding experience I've ever felt compared to some like ETA 2824 movements, which is also not super refined, but a step up from the 4R36 movement. However, it does have hacking and hand winding. Okay, pull it out. As you can see, the second hand has now stopped. So hacking, definitely a cool feature, although not completely necessary. I mean, it's a nice to have, so you could get a little bit more accurate when setting the time, even though, you know, in a couple of days or a couple of weeks running this on the wrist, it is going to start to get out of sync just due to the inaccuracy in general. So that's why, in general, hacking isn't the biggest deal for me, but I could see why people like it. Now, I got a nice little toy, and this is a UV flashlight that I'm going to use to actually check the lume for once on the SRPD95. So let's light this up and give it a check. So here we could see the lume is pretty respectable, not quite as bright as the Seiko SKX, and I will give that a comparison in a second, but we can see it has a little bit more of a blue hue as opposed to the traditional green hue, which is pretty cool. Here you can see the Lume of the SKX and the 5KX side by side, and like I said, pretty respectable for sure. Not quite as bright as Seiko SKX's Lume, but still really amazing, and you know, better than a lot of other brands. A couple of other notes and additions about this watch: it does have drilled lug holes, which makes strap changes much easier. And of course, speaking of strap, this comes on a sort of Milanese mesh style rubber strap, which the quality is fine, but man, I think this thing is absolutely horrendous looking, if I'm being completely honest. I think this is a watch that looks fantastic on a bracelet. For example, a mesh bracelet, as they've kind of demonstrated in the similar looking SRPD95, I believe it is, but really any bracelet. I know Strapcode has amazing alternatives. You could even, honestly, it is a little bit sacrilegious to wear a leather strap on a dive watch, but on this type of, you know, slightly more casual and dressy dive watch, heck, I'll rock it. Why not? I think it would look fantastic on either a brown or a black vintage style strap. Now, with that said, let's throw this on the wrist and see how it wears. Quick wrist check. Today I'm wearing my Seagull 1963. I absolutely love this thing. This is a 38mm version with sapphire crystal. The ST19 chronograph movement is absolutely amazing. It's decorated super well, and for the price, it's really hard to beat a fully mechanical chronograph that actually has some heritage and history to it. So I really like this piece, and it's kind of a mainstay in my personal collection. Okay, now we can see the watch on the wrist and how it actually wears on my recently discovered that my wrist is only 6.5 inches. For the longest time, for some reason, I thought it was 7, but hey, size matters. So the dimensions of this piece: the diameter is 42.5 millimeters, but as you could see, it wears extremely well, and that is largely attributed to the relatively condensed 46 millimeters lug to lug. So it wears exactly like that Seiko SKX. Like I said, the case is identical, at least in dimensions, shape, etc. So it wears really, really well. And this is a watch that, even though 42 millimeters, some people feel it's slightly on the larger side, this is a watch that would fit pretty much any wrist, except if you have maybe, you know, the smallest of wrist under 6 inches. You might struggle with this just a little bit, because generally, as long as the lug to lug doesn't go over the ends of your wrist, you're generally fine, and it will look at least reasonably appropriate on you, as I think this does on me. It has a thickness of 13.5 millimeters, which is partially accentuated by the display case back and also the bezel itself, although it doesn't actually visually look like a 13.5 millimeter thick watch, because as stated earlier, the dial itself is kind of a little bit sunken beneath the chapter ring, so it kind of does look a little bit thinner from different angles. And then finally, we have a 22 millimeter lug width. So not my favorite lug width. Personally, I'm more of a 20 millimeter kind of guy, but for a 42 millimeter watch, I think it's absolutely appropriate. And you know, for dive watches in general that tend to have a little bit more presence, I think it's perfectly fine. Now let's give it another side by side with this Seiko SKX. You could see overall the Seiko SKX is just a much more kind of aggressive and tool watch and durable, hefty looking piece, whereas the 5KX Sports Diver, at least the SRPD95, is a little bit more refined, a little bit more sophisticated looking. And you know what? I do like having both in my collection, so I could kind of get the essence of the SKX when I still want to wear something a little bit more refined. But you know, the SKX will always be my baby, because it was one of my first automatic watches I've ever got, and this thing has been with me through so much, and it's just an absolute workhorse. However, since it's been discontinued, the prices have kind of gone a little bit rampant, and just because of that, I don't still tend to recommend it to people, because it was a great watch at, you know, $200, $250, but now that they're going for $350, $450, even $500 sometimes I see, which is absolutely ridiculous. I just think there's better watches for the money in this day and age, but you know, for someone who started out with SKX in their collection, my 5KX will never actually replace it. This is kind of more of like an addition. So speaking of which, let's talk value. I believe this watch retails for $275. However, they can often be found for under $200, sometimes even as little as $150, which is definitely on the cheaper, more affordable side for this piece, but it's not undoable. I know Macy's sometimes sells it, Amazon, sometimes it even just, you know, goes on Amazon for $160 or something. And for that price, I think it's an absolute cracking watch. I mean, it's the same price in that case as like a Fossil watch as a lot of the fashion watches out there. And, you know, compared to those types of watches, of course, it's miles and miles and leaps and bounds ahead. But even in general, compared to a lot of the competition out there, you know, Seiko still continues to deliver very, very high quality pieces for the money. Now, it, in my opinion, doesn't live up to the value of the Seiko SKX that was, you know, really, really tried and true and just had a lot going for it. ISO certification, 200-meter water resistance for $200. But for a different type of watch, one that's a little bit more casual, slightly more sophisticated, slightly more refined, and you have such a large variety to choose from for different styles, colors, I think the Seiko 5KX sports divers are still definitely worth a look at and an excellent value. So who is this watch for? I think the 5KX is great for either someone getting into the hobby for the first time or just someone who wants a very, very nice looking everyday piece without breaking the bank. Maybe you're someone who does go swimming, but you're not a professional diver, and if you're a professional diver, you're likely okay with spending a little bit more on a piece that will actually do that for you, that will actually serve that purpose. And that's not this, but that's okay. That's not what this is for. This is a great watch that's going to look great, continue to run for a very, very long time. Seiko's movements are very reliable workhorses, and you know, you have the Seiko heritage, you have the SKX heritage and the lineage in here, while also having a little bit of its own charm as well, and all while not breaking the bank. So although some people will be mad at this piece because it's not the SKX, that's also the beauty of it. It's not the SKX, and you know, it has its own things going for it. So with that said, thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you did enjoy. Let me know if you've ever owned the 5KX or which model you do own if you have ever owned one. And let me know which model you guys think I should pick up next. Like I said, I might actually swap out my SRPD95 for a different model. I'm just not actually sure. Actually, the rose gold one looks pretty cool. I don't have a rose gold diver, but that's neither here nor there. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like if you haven't already. Would really, really appreciate it. It helps me out, feeds the YouTube algorithm. Full review on the blog, chronometercheck.com, in the description below. With that said, thank you for watching.